Rancher gives water to wounded native. What he faced next day were hundreds of arrows stuck in. The sun was beginning its descent behind the rolling hills as the rancher worked in the fields. His hands, weathered and rough from years of labor, guided the reins with a steady grip. The air was dry, heavy with the scent of dust and earth. The ranch stretched far beyond the horizon, a lonely stretch of land he had come to call home. The rancher, a man in his late 30s with a broad chest and strong legs, had lived this life for as long as he could remember. He had cattle to care for, fences to mend, and the land itself to protect. There was no time for much else. His name was Thomas, though most folks in town simply called him the Rancher. He didn't mind the nickname. It wasn't important to him whether anyone knew his first name. He preferred the quiet, solitary life. He had his cattle, his horses, and his land to tend to. That was enough for him. That evening, as the sun sank lower in the sky, Thomas was moving the cattle into a holding pen for the night. The long hours of the day had started to take their toll, but the work was far from over. He'd need to check the fences one last time before heading back to the small cabin he called home. As he made his way back down the dusty path toward the barn, Thomas spotted something unusual out of the corner of his eye. Near the edge of his property, just past a cluster of old trees, there was a figure stumbling through the grass. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him, but the figure grew clearer as he rode closer. It was a man, a native man, badly wounded. His clothes were torn, and there were deep gashes across his chest. He staggered, barely able to keep his footing as he walked, his movements slow and labored. Thomas's horse shifted uneasily beneath him, but he pulled the reins, bringing the animal to a halt. He didn't know what to make of it. The relationship between settlers like him and the native tribes had been tense for years. Some had even called for them to be driven off their land. Many people had fears of what would happen if they showed any signs of kindness to the native people. But this man, this stranger, was clearly in pain and he needed help. Without thinking too much, Thomas dismounted his horse. He was no doctor, but he knew enough to see that this man wouldn't last long without help. His chest heaved with every breath, and blood oozed from his wounds, staining the earth beneath him. He was barely able to stand. The rancher approached cautiously, his boots crunching against the dry ground. The native man looked up at him, his eyes barely able to focus. He seemed as though he wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. "You're hurt," Thomas said softly, though he wasn't sure if the man could even understand him. He didn't know much about the native tongue, but he knew the universal language of compassion. "I can help. You need water." The man blinked, and for a moment, Thomas thought he might collapse. But the stranger took a trembling step forward, his hand reaching out. The rancher quickly pulled the canteen from his saddle and handed it to the man. The native took the water with shaky hands, drinking greedily, his parched throat desperate for relief. He could barely swallow, his body shuddering from the effort. Thomas watched as the man drank. It felt wrong to leave him out there alone, vulnerable and in pain. And yet there was the danger. If anyone found out he had helped, he could be branded as a sympathizer, a traitor. There had been whispers in town about the increasing raids on settlers by the native tribes, but Thomas had always believed that the violence was fueled by misunderstanding, not by the people themselves. The native man finished the water and handed the canteen back to Thomas. His lips were cracked, and his eyes looked haunted, as though the pain wasn't just physical. There was something deeper, something older behind those eyes.
I can't leave you out here like this," Thomas muttered to himself. He hesitated, then made up his mind.
"I'll take you back to my cabin. You can rest there for the night." It was a risk, but the rancher had never been one to shy away from helping someone in need, no matter who they were. Besides, the man was in no condition to walk on his own, and Thomas wasn't about to let him die out there alone in the wilderness. He helped the native man onto his horse, supporting him as best he could. The man leaned against him, his breathing shallow but steadier now. Thomas led the horse slowly back to the cabin, his thoughts racing. He wondered how the people in town would react if they knew what he had done. Some would applaud him, but most would probably see him as a fool, someone who had put his own life in danger for a stranger. The tension between the settlers and the native tribes had only grown worse in recent months. and no one wanted to risk being caught in the middle. As they reached the cabin, Thomas helped the wounded man down from the horse and guided him inside. The cabin was small but comfortable enough. There was a fire already crackling in the hearth, and the rancher quickly set about preparing a place for the man to rest. He didn't have much in the way of medical supplies, but he managed to find some clean cloth to bandage the man's wounds. The native man, though he was exhausted, gave Thomas a grateful look. The rancher could tell that words weren't necessary. He had done the right thing, even if it had been a risky choice. The man would survive for the night, and that was all Thomas could offer. As the night wore on, Thomas kept the fire burning. He sat by the hearth, his mind full of questions. What would happen tomorrow? Would the man try to leave without a word, or would he stay for a time? And what of the other settlers? Would they find out what he had done? It was a dangerous game he was playing, but at that moment, it didn't matter. The rancher didn't know it yet, but this single act of kindness would change everything. Tomorrow, he would wake up to a world much different than the one he had left behind when the sun set that evening, and the native man, whose name Thomas did not yet know, would have a part to play in it. But for now, the rancher simply leaned back in his chair, watching the fire flicker and dance in the hearth. The world outside might be harsh, but here, in his cabin, he had made a choice driven by something deeper than fear. And for the first time in a long while, Thomas allowed himself a moment of peace. The morning light filtered through the small window of the cabin, casting soft golden rays across the room. Thomas woke slowly, stretching his stiff limbs from a night of uneasy sleep. His thoughts immediately went to the wounded native man. He turned toward the corner of the room where the stranger had been resting. The man was still there, lying on the makeshift bed Thomas had set up for him. His breathing was steady, though it was clear the man hadn't fully recovered. The rancher's mind was a whirlwind. The night had been quiet, but the weight of his decision to help the stranger was heavy on his conscience. He wondered what would happen next. Would the native man stay, or would he leave as quickly as he had come, slipping away into the vast wilderness again? Thomas stood up and quietly moved to the window. The early morning mist still clung to the fields outside, and the sound of cattle grazing reached his ears. The day seemed calm, almost too calm. But he knew better than to think that things would stay peaceful for long. He was living in a time when peace was fragile and the world outside was unpredictable. There was always the threat of danger, whether from the native tribes or from others who feared them. As he made his way to the kitchen, he prepared a simple breakfast, some bread, eggs, and a little bacon. The smell filled the cabin, and for a moment he allowed himself to enjoy the small comforts of home. He was used to being alone, but there was something different about the stillness today. There was someone else in the cabin now, someone whose presence filled the space with tension. It was the weight of the unknown. The native man stirred on the bed as Thomas set the breakfast on the table. He looked over, his eyes half open, as though he were trying to make sense of his surroundings. Thomas hesitated for a moment before speaking. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice gentle, not wanting to startle the man. The stranger nodded slowly, his eyes squinting against the light. He spoke in a language Thomas couldn't understand, but the rancher could tell from the tone that the man was trying to convey gratitude. Thomas sat at the table, motioning for the man to join him. "You need to eat. You've lost a lot of blood." The native man sat up, wincing as he did so. His injuries were still fresh, and every movement seemed to cause him pain. He was strong, though, Thomas could tell. The rancher watched quietly as the man accepted the food and ate with slow, deliberate motions. Thomas, on the other hand, didn't eat right away. He was too busy thinking about the future. Would the man try to leave today? Would he risk staying here longer, or would he choose to disappear back into the wilderness, where the rancher wouldn't be able to follow? He thought about the rumors he'd heard in town. There had been talk of raids, of settlers being attacked. Some people said the native tribes were becoming more aggressive. Others believed that the violence came from fear, a desperation to protect their land. But Thomas had always wondered if there could be a way to stop the bloodshed. If everyone would just listen to each other, if they could set aside their prejudices and fears, could there be peace? But that was a dream, and dreams didn't belong in the real world. In the real world, actions had consequences. The native man finished his meal and looked at Thomas, his gaze heavy with something the rancher couldn't quite place. The stranger seemed to be considering something, and for a moment Thomas wondered if the man would speak. But there were no words. Instead, the man slowly stood up from the bed, testing his strength. His face tightened as he moved, but he made it to his feet, swaying slightly. "Where will you go now?" Thomas asked quietly. "You can't travel in your condition." The man paused, his eyes darting to the door. Thomas saw the hesitation there, the uncertainty. He wasn't sure if the man was afraid of what might happen if he stayed, or if he simply didn't want to be a burden. "I can't keep you here forever," Thomas continued, though he felt the guilt pressing on him. "The people in town, they're not going to understand. They might come after you." The native man looked back at him, as though weighing his options. Then, with a slight shake of his head, he walked toward the door. Thomas immediately stood up, alarmed. "Wait, you can't leave like this," he said, but the man held up a hand, a quiet gesture that stopped Thomas in his tracks. The rancher didn't know what to say. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him again. The door was still open, and beyond it the world stretched out before him, a world full of danger, uncertainty, and risks. But beyond that world, there was something else. Something deeper. He could feel it in his bones. The man was more than just a stranger. There was a connection, a shared understanding, even if unspoken. The native man gave him a final glance, then stepped outside. Thomas hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. His feet felt rooted to the floor, but his heart urged him to go after the man. There was something about the way he moved, about the quiet strength he carried, that made Thomas wonder if he could somehow help. But as he stepped toward the door, he heard the distant sound of hoofbeats, growing louder by the second. "It wasn't just one rider. It sounded like a group." Thomas froze. His heart raced. His first instinct was to hide. He turned back toward the cabin, his mind racing. He couldn't risk it. He couldn't let anyone see that he had helped a native man. But the rancher knew he couldn't run from what was happening. The sound of the hoofbeats grew closer, and he knew he had little time. Outside, the native man had stopped in his tracks, his eyes scanning the horizon. Thomas stepped outside quickly, his heart pounding. He approached the man cautiously, his voice low. "I don't know who they are, but you need to hide. We're not safe." The man didn't say anything. He simply nodded, as if he already knew what was coming. He didn't seem afraid, though. Instead, there was a quiet determination in his gaze, a sense of readiness. The rancher turned and hurried back into the cabin, his mind spinning. There was no time to waste. He had to decide quickly. The native man needed to hide, but Thomas couldn't do it alone. He needed help. But who could he trust in a world where everyone seemed to be against him? The hoofbeats grew louder still, echoing through the empty landscape. It was no longer a matter of if danger would come. It was here, right at the doorstep, and Thomas had no choice but to face it. The sound of the approaching riders was unmistakable. It grew louder and faster, echoing across the vast open land. Thomas's heart pounded as he turned back to the native man. There was no time to think. The rancher could feel the tension thick in the air as he realized that the danger had arrived. "They're almost here," Thomas whispered urgently, his voice filled with fear. He had no way of knowing who these riders were, but he knew one thing for sure: they couldn't be good news. His mind raced, thoughts flashing through his head at a dizzying pace. Should he fight? Should he hide? He had to protect the man, but what could he do in the face of whatever was coming? The native man didn't say a word. His expression was calm, but there was a fire in his eyes. Thomas didn't understand how he could be so composed in the face of danger. But the rancher didn't have time to figure it out. The hoofbeats grew louder, and they were closer now. Thomas turned and made a snap decision. "We need to hide," he said, his voice desperate. He motioned for the native man to follow him. Without a word, the man obeyed, his movements quick and sure despite his injuries. Thomas led him to the back of the cabin, where a small shed sat near the edge of the property. It wasn't much, just a little wooden structure where Thomas kept his tools and spare supplies. The rancher had never thought of it as a hiding spot before, but in that moment it was the only place that made sense. They reached the shed in a few quick strides, and Thomas quickly pulled open the door. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sawdust and wood. The rancher pushed the door wider, and the native man ducked inside. Thomas followed closely behind, and the door creaked shut with a soft thud. Inside the shed, the light was dim, filtered through small cracks in the wood. The two men stood still, their breaths shallow as they listened for any sounds from outside. The hoofbeats had slowed, and the rancher's pulse quickened as he realized that whoever was coming was close. Too close. He leaned against the shed wall, his mind racing. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. If these were enemies, there was no telling what would happen. If they found the native man, everything would be over. The rancher had no weapons. He was just a man trying to protect a stranger, a man who had risked everything to offer a helping hand. The native man stood still, his back against the wall, his expression unreadable, his hand, still wounded, rested at his sides. It was clear he was in pain, but there was something else there, something stronger. He was calm, focused, ready for whatever might come next. Outside, the hoofbeats had stopped. Thomas held his breath, straining to hear the faintest sound. His hand clenched into a fist, his mind filled with fear and uncertainty. What were they waiting for?
Who were they? Then the sound of voices reached them, low murmurs just barely audible through the thin walls of the shed.
Thomas couldn't make out the words, but he knew they were speaking in a language he didn't understand. The rancher felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The men had arrived. They were close now, too close. Thomas could hear the sound of boots crunching on the dry ground as the riders dismounted, their movements slow and deliberate. He cursed under his breath, knowing that hiding in the shed wouldn't keep them safe for long. "We have to be quiet," Thomas whispered urgently, looking at the native man. His eyes locked with the rancher's, and for the first time there was a hint of something deeper in his gaze, a quiet understanding. The native man didn't need words to communicate. He knew what was at stake. The voices outside grew louder. The men were speaking now, clearly discussing something, but the rancher couldn't make out their words. It didn't matter. He had to stay hidden. He had to protect the man, no matter the cost. The sound of a door creaking open came from outside. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He froze, holding his breath, willing himself to stay calm. His eyes darted around the shed. There was nowhere to hide but the dark corners. He prayed they wouldn't search the shed. The voices outside grew louder, then softer, and finally Thomas heard the unmistakable sound of someone approaching the back of the cabin. The rancher's chest tightened, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. It was too close. They were almost here! Suddenly the door of the shed creaked open. Thomas held his breath as the figure of a man appeared in the doorway, a silhouette against the bright light outside. For a moment, everything went still. Time seemed to freeze. The rancher's mind raced, and then, without thinking, he pushed the native man further into the darkness of the shed, moving silently. The man outside didn't speak at first. He stood there for a long moment, peering into the shed. Thomas held his breath, praying that the man wouldn't look further. "Nothing here," the rider muttered to himself, stepping back from the door. Thomas's heart thudded in his chest, but he didn't move. He kept his eyes fixed on the figure outside, waiting for him to leave. The man stood in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, his eyes scanning the area. The rancher couldn't breathe, couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, terrified that any sudden movement would give them away. Finally, the rider turned and walked away, his boots crunching on the ground. Thomas let out a silent breath of relief, feeling his body relax just a little. But the danger wasn't over. The man might come back, and if he did, they wouldn't have much time left. The voices outside had quieted, and the sounds of movement seemed to drift further away. Thomas waited, listening intently, His mind was still racing, but for now, they were safe. For now, he turned to the native man. The stranger's eyes were still fixed on him, calm as ever. There was a quiet strength in his gaze, a sense of resilience that made Thomas feel small in comparison. The rancher's throat felt dry, but he managed to speak. "That was too close," he said softly. The native man didn't reply, but he nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. For a moment they stood in silence, both of them listening to the stillness outside. They were hidden, but Thomas knew that it was only a matter of time before the riders left or found them again. Outside, the world seemed eerily quiet. Thomas waited, his thoughts swirling, unsure of what to do next. The danger had passed for now, but it was only a temporary relief. He couldn't run from what was happening. His life was changing, and he couldn't stop it. As he looked at the native man, he realized something. This wasn't just a chance encounter. This was the beginning of something much bigger. The choices he had made, helping a stranger, offering water to a wounded man, had set everything in motion, and no matter what happened next, he would have to live with the consequences. The minutes felt like hours as Thomas and the native man stood in the darkness of the shed, waiting. The silence outside was unsettling, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, thudding loudly in the quiet. He glanced at the native man, who stood with quiet strength, his face unreadable. Thomas felt a rush of gratitude for this stranger. This man he had saved, but there was no time to think about it. The riders had stopped searching for now, but that didn't mean they had given up. The rancher knew that sooner or later they would return, and when they did, things would change forever. The shed, small and cramped, felt more like a prison than a shelter. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and dust, and the faint light from the cracks in the walls barely illuminated their surroundings. Thomas's mind was racing as he tried to figure out what to do next. The most logical choice would be to get out of there, to leave the ranch behind and run. But where could they go? The nearest town was too far, and if they tried to cross the open land, they would be exposed. Hiding in the wilderness didn't seem like an option either. The rancher had no idea who these riders were, or if there were more of them lurking nearby. He glanced over at the native man, whose quiet presence was oddly comforting. This man had been through things Thomas could never imagine. There was a calmness about him, an air of quiet resilience that seemed unshakable, even in the face of danger. Thomas wondered who he was and where he had come from, but now was not the time to ask questions. "How long do you think they'll stay?" Thomas asked in a whisper, though he wasn't sure if the native man would even understand him. The rancher had no idea what the situation would look like when the riders returned. Would they search the cabin again? Would they leave, satisfied that there was nothing to find? The native man didn't answer. Instead, he stood silently, listening, his sharp eyes scanning the small shed as if waiting for some sign. Thomas didn't press him. He could feel the weight of the silence between them, but it wasn't an uncomfortable one. There was an understanding there, two men trapped in a dangerous situation, trying to figure out their next move. Minutes dragged by, and still there was no sound from outside. The only noise was the occasional creak of the cabin as it settled, and the low hum of the wind. Thomas was beginning to feel the weight of their predicament. If the riders didn't leave soon, they would have to make a decision. They couldn't stay hidden forever. They had to move. But how? "I can't stay here," Thomas finally muttered to himself. The idea of running from his home, abandoning everything he had worked for, made him feel sick, but he knew it might be the only choice. If the riders came back and found the native man, there was no telling what would happen. The native man glanced at him, as if he had heard the words, though he said nothing. His gaze was steady, but there was something in his eyes that made Thomas feel uneasy. It was as if the man understood more than he was letting on. Perhaps the rancher wasn't the one in charge of their fate after all. Suddenly there was a sound from outside, a faint movement. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He strained his ears, trying to make sense of it. Had the riders returned? Were they searching again? The sound was faint, but it was getting closer. Thomas stood up quickly, his muscles tensing, his body on high alert. The native man's eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively reaching toward the small bag at his side. The rancher didn't know what the man was planning, but he didn't question it. They had to be ready for whatever came next. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. Thomas could hear them moving, slowly, cautiously, as if the riders were trying to be quiet. His hand instinctively reached for the door of the shed, ready to pull it open if they needed to escape. His mind raced, but there was no good plan. They had no weapons, no way to fight back. They were trapped. Then, just as quickly as it started, the sound stopped. Silence once again descended upon them. The rancher waited, holding his breath, as if the very air was frozen. Had they been discovered, or was it just a trick of his nerves? Seconds ticked by like hours. Still there was no sound. No movement. Thomas turned to the native man, who gave him a single nod, almost imperceptible. The rancher wasn't sure what it meant, but he trusted it. They had to stay calm. No matter what was happening outside, they couldn't let their fear control them. The door of the shed creaked ever so slightly. The rancher tensed, ready for anything. Was someone opening it? Was it time to run? His breath caught in his throat as the handle turned slowly and the door began to open. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the dim light outside. Thomas instinctively took a step back, but before he could move further, he heard a voice. "Is anyone in here?" The voice was soft, uncertain, almost hesitant. It was not the voice of a rider or an enemy. This voice was different, less threatening.
Thomas didn't know what to do.
He stood still, his heart racing. Was this a trap? Was someone trying to catch them off guard? He held his breath, waiting for the stranger's next move. Then the figure stepped fully inside. It was a woman. Her face was familiar, though Thomas couldn't place her immediately. She was dressed in worn clothes, much like his own, but there was something about her that seemed out of place. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the interior of the shed. She didn't look like one of the riders. In fact, she looked as confused as he was. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said, holding up her hands in a peaceful gesture. Her voice was calm, but there was a tension in it. "I was just looking for someone. A man. I was told he might be here." Thomas's mind raced. Who was this woman? And why was she here? The native man, still silent, stood at the back of the shed, watching the woman carefully. His eyes never left her, though his stance was relaxed. It was as if he already knew who she was, or at least that she wasn't a threat. The woman's eyes shifted toward him, and for a moment there was a silent exchange between them, an understanding that passed between the two. Thomas felt out of place, uncertain of what to do or say, but the native man's steady gaze seemed to calm him, as though everything would be fine. "I think..." "You might be looking for me," the native man said finally, his voice low and steady. His words were simple but clear, and Thomas could tell the woman knew exactly who he was. The rancher blinked, his confusion growing. What was happening? Had this woman been looking for the native man all along? You're the one I'm supposed to find, the woman said, her voice breaking the silence. There was a strange urgency in her words. "They said you were here, that you could help. We need your help." Thomas felt a chill run through him as he processed her words. Help? What was she talking about? What could they possibly need from a wounded man hiding in a shed? "Who are you?" Thomas asked, his voice betraying the confusion in his mind. The woman took a deep breath and looked at both men. "My name is Sarah," she said, her voice steady now. "And I think it's time we stop running." The quiet in the shed felt more oppressive than ever. Thomas stood still, processing Sarah's words. His mind was spinning. He had never expected this moment, this woman appearing in the middle of their hiding, claiming to need help. The native man seemed to understand more than Thomas, his eyes narrowing as he studied Sarah with an almost unreadable expression. "Stop running?" Thomas repeated slowly, unsure what she meant. The words felt like they were from another world, one Thomas hadn't entered yet. What did she know that he didn't? What do you mean? Sarah hesitated, her hands still raised in a non-threatening manner. Her face, though worn and tired, had a determined look in her eyes. There's more to this than just hiding, she said. I was sent to find him. She glanced at the native man, then back at Thomas, her voice quieter now. You've both been caught up in something much bigger than you realize. Thomas felt a cold shiver creep up his spine. What had they gotten themselves into? He had only tried to do the right thing, help someone in need. But this felt different now. He looked over at the native man, whose eyes met his without fear or hesitation. There was a calm understanding in his gaze, as though he had seen all this before, and somehow knew how it would unfold. But Thomas didn't. He felt out of his depth. The air in the shed felt thick with tension, and yet the woman's calm presence began to ease the tightness in his chest. She wasn't a threat, at least not in the way he had feared. But her words lingered, heavy and cryptic. What did she mean? I don't understand, Thomas said, stepping closer to Sarah. What do you mean by bigger than we realize? Why did you come here, and who sent you? Sarah took a deep breath, her expression softening. She knew this was hard for Thomas to comprehend, but there was no time to waste on hesitation. I'm not just some stranger, she said.
I'm part of a group, one that's been trying to bring peace, a group that's been trying to stop the violence, the misunderstandings.
The native tribes and the settlers, it's all tied together. She paused, watching Thomas carefully. The man you helped isn't just a stranger. He's important. Thomas stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. Important? He repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. He couldn't understand. His mind was racing. Why hadn't the man told him any of this? Why hadn't he known? The native man stepped forward, then, his voice steady and calm, though his eyes held a deeper weight than Thomas had ever seen before. It was never about just survival, he said softly. This isn't just about one man helping another. There's a bigger story at play. He felt his world shift beneath him, as though the ground he stood on had suddenly become unstable. Everything he had known, everything he had believed, seemed to be in question. But Sarah and the native man's presence, their quiet strength, made him want to listen. He wanted to understand, to make sense of the tangled mess he had found himself in. The native man glanced at Sarah, who nodded slightly. I didn't just need shelter, the man continued. I needed to find someone. Someone who can help end the violence and bring peace. And you've unknowingly become part of that path. I didn't sign up for any of this, he muttered. He had only wanted to help a wounded man. He never expected this larger conflict to appear on his doorstep. I know, Sarah said, her voice soft with understanding. But sometimes we don't choose the path. The path chooses us. Thomas felt like he was drowning in words he couldn't quite understand. The weight of their meaning pressed down on him. And what path is that? He asked, barely able to form the question. The native man's gaze turned serious, his eyes burning with a quiet intensity. It's the path of unity, he said simply. It's the path of understanding. Sarah stepped forward, her face now more determined. The native tribes. They've been misunderstood, treated unfairly for too long. There are some who would rather see them wiped out than find a way to live together. But there are others, like us, who believe it's possible. That's why I'm here. I'm here to help change the way things have always been. Thomas felt like he was being pulled into something much bigger than himself. His life as a rancher, his solitary existence, seemed like it belonged to another time. His chest tightened with the weight of the decision he now faced. Could he be part of something like this? Could he leave everything behind and step into this new reality? But why me? Thomas asked. He had never been involved in any political struggles or conflicts. He had always kept to himself, focused on his ranch, his animals. What could he possibly offer to this larger movement? Sarah met his gaze, her expression serious but warm. Because you made the choice to help him, she said, motioning toward the native man. That act, that simple kindness, has already set you on this path. It's not about what you have or what you've done in the past. It's about your heart. You've chosen to do what's right, no matter the consequences, and that is the foundation of what we need. Thomas felt a strange mixture of awe and fear. He had never thought of himself as a hero. He had just been trying to do the right thing, but somehow it seemed that his small act of kindness had tied him to something much larger than he could have imagined. "Then what happens now?" he asked, his voice quieter, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Sarah's eyes softened as she spoke. "Now we move forward, together! You're not alone in this. We'll help you understand what needs to be done. But you have to trust us!" The rancher stood there, processing everything he had learned. The fear still lingered in his chest, but something else began to take its place, a strange sense of purpose. Perhaps it was because deep down he had always known that the world could be better, that peace could be possible, even if it felt like a distant dream. And now, for the first time, he felt like he was holding a piece of that dream in his hands. As the native man and Sarah exchanged a brief but meaningful glance, Thomas knew that everything had changed. His life had taken a new direction, one that was uncertain and filled with challenges, but it was a path that offered something he had never thought possible, the chance to make a real difference. "I'll do what I can," Thomas said finally, his voice firm. It wasn't a declaration of certainty, but it was a commitment, and that was all he could give at that moment. The native man nodded once, a small but meaningful gesture. "That's all we need," he said simply. The rancher stood there for a moment, still processing, but he knew in his heart that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and hardships, but it was a road that held the possibility of hope, of change, and of something greater than himself. For the first time in his life, Thomas felt like he was part of something that mattered.